Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 14 March 2025. It is the 316th anniversary of the birth of Gabriel Bonnot, who was born at Mably, Loire, and became better known as Gabriel Bonnot de Mably. It's not uncommon to see him referred to as the Abbé de Mably, and I will identify him simply as Mably in what follows. To be an abbé in early modern France was a sinecure in which one received an income from a monastery without actually having to do any work. Voltaire skewered the office of abbé in the first entry of his philosophical dictionary, where he pointed out the irony of an office that was once a poor man serving other poor men, now being wealthy and having a retinue of guards. Mably wasn't known for exploiting his office, but the income gave him the freedom to become one of the great historians of the Enlightenment. We think of the Enlightenment not only as a movement of rationalism, but also as being fundamentally optimistic. In my episode on an early modern science of civilization, I mentioned the painting British Gentleman in Rome of 1750 by Scottish artist Catherine Reed, and how our own self-portrait captures the enigmatic smile of the Enlightenment. Kenneth Clark commented on this, calling it the smile of reason. But it's strange to make any connection like this between reason and optimism, since thoughtful people in general, and philosophers in particular, aren't especially known for their sunny outlook on life. Ecclesiastes tells us, "For in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow." Spengler went so far as to say that optimism is cowardice. We are born into this time and must bravely follow the path to the destined end. And clearly, Spengler didn't anticipate that the destined end would be a matter of happily ever after. Spengler's pessimism looms large over the philosophy of history, and it doesn't matter how many takedowns there are of Spengler and Schopenhauer, we all know that they've testified to the dark underbelly of the human condition, and like it or not, pessimism has powerful arguments on its side. It would be easy to write off 19th century pessimism as a form of romanticism, a kind of luxuriating in melancholy, and we could with equal ease write off 20th century pessimism as a rational response to that violent century. But there's also such a thing as Enlightenment pessimism, and Mably was a pessimist of the Enlightenment. Mably, too, is seen smiling in his portrait, showing him as a man of his age, but he was also a man in conflict with his age. In the volume, The Social and Political Ideas of Some Great French Thinkers of the Age of Reason, a series of lectures delivered at King's College, University of London during the session 1928-1929, C.H. Driver gives us an interesting portrait of Mably. He describes Mably's early success in life as the private secretary of a well-connected and politically powerful cardinal. For a few years as the cardinal's secretary, he was involved in diplomacy, but he quarreled with the cardinal, and that was the end of that. Driver goes on to write of Mably, quote, "Mably lived in strict retirement for the rest of his life. He refused to be under an obligation to anybody and withdrew completely from men and from practical affairs. He consecrated himself entirely to his love of Greek and Roman antiquity, to his philosophy and to his writings, and attempted first, by reading and reflection, to find the path to happiness and virtue for mankind, and then to point out that path by voluminous writings to an evil and unhappy world. His retirement accentuated in him, apparently, his native reserve, austerity, and pessimism, features which run through his works and his life to the end." Unquote. Many writers refer to Mably's pessimism. He also became famous, or notorious, as you prefer, for his advocacy of a nascent form of communism. In a contribution to the volume The Secular Mind, Transformations of Faith in Modern Europe, John Frederick Logan wrote in his contribution, Superstition, Impiety, and the Enlightened Legal Order, the Theological Politics of Abbé Mably, quote, A prolific author whose oeuvres complètes fill some 15 volumes and touch on a wide variety of topics, Mably was to influence both the Jacobins and the Babovists, as well as much of subsequent revolutionary socialism. Although Mably's views on private property have provoked considerable scholarly debate, his confrontation with the pivotal issue of the proper scope and role of religious belief has largely escaped attention. Yet Mably did, in several of his works, come to grips with this issue, most explicitly in his essay titled De la Superstition, unquote. It's not difficult to understand the attraction that Mably exercised due to his early advocacy of communism, when such things were rarely, if ever, conceived. His historical pessimism is much more interesting to me, and philosophy of history could probably benefit from a better appreciation of the role of pessimism, and for that matter, the role of optimism in the understanding of history. Henry Weiverberg wrote an entire book on historical pessimism in the French Enlightenment, in which he wrote, quote, "Nature, Mably insists, is good, and the natural man necessarily shares in this goodness. Here Mably encounters the internal enigma of the genesis of evil out of good. As a solution, he simply asserts that man himself, as contrasted with nature, is the author of evil. Man and society have strayed inexplicably from the bosom of nature and must reintegrate themselves in the natural order. The first model for this reintegration is not savage pre-civilization, but rather the simple and austere republics of antiquity. It is an uncomplicated social life at which Mably aims, a regime based upon non-property equality and distinguished by the absence of that avarice and luxury which are inseparable from the pursuit of commercial gain," unquote. And in the introduction to the same, Weiverberg summarizes his project in this way, quote, "A belief in progress was neither the exclusive focus nor the one logical consummation of enlightened French philosophy, and that historical pessimism, too, had its roots deep in the philosophical movement itself. The 18th century saw a rich proliferation of intellectual currents, and within this growth lay potentialities immensely dangerous to that rationalistic, optimistic synthesis which is too often assumed to have been the ultimate contribution of the century. The thought of the Enlightenment was neither as disembodied and visionary, nor as simple or oversimplified as it was once imagined, and as it is pictured now and again in our own day," unquote. This seems to me to be an important corrective to our understanding of the Enlightenment. And we can find support for this view of the Enlightenment outside France in the writings of the founding fathers of the United States. The Federalist Papers include any number of melancholy reflections on human nature, for example. James Madison wrote, quote, "As there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence," unquote. Alexander Hamilton wrote, quote, "Has it not invariably been found that momentary passions and immediate interests have a more active and imperious control over human conduct than general or remote considerations of policy, utility, or justice?" unquote. And Thomas Jefferson wrote, quote, "In questions of power, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution," unquote. Whether or not we want to call this view of human nature pessimism, we could just as well call it a mixed view of human nature. Mably's pessimism wasn't exactly the same view of human nature held by the founding fathers. And it also wasn't the metaphysical pessimism of Schopenhauer. His pessimism was based on the outcome of contingent historical events. This is the pessimism of a disappointed idealist. All of the sources on Mably that I'm quoting today go into detailed explanation of the unfolding political events in France during Mably's time. And again, a hopeful beginning was followed by a disappointing conclusion. Chance and not necessity made Mably a pessimist. And of course, Mably wasn't the only one who was disappointed by the failure of governmental reforms in the run-up to the revolution, which began only 4 years after Mably died. It was precisely this widely shared disappointment that made the French Revolution possible. In a counterfactual history in which the French monarchy had voluntarily and successfully reformed itself, there would have been no revolution, no reign of terror, no Napoleon or Napoleonic Wars, no Treaty of Paris, no June Rebellion of 1832, no February Revolution of 1848, and no Paris Commune of 1871. I leave it as an exercise to the listener whether there would have been a First World War or a second. But for the French monarchy to have voluntarily and successfully reformed itself, rather than being violently deposed, would have required political courage, moral virtue, and intellectual acuity. There were men in pre-revolutionary France with the necessary character, but they didn't get the backing they needed from the king and his ministers, and the ruling class themselves lacked these virtues. When these qualities of character were eventually expressed in the revolution, they were transformed by the revolution into something destructive. The revolutionaries themselves did possess political courage, moral virtue, and intellectual acuity. Even Robespierre, but it was mixed with political weakness, moral failings, and intellectual blind spots. The revolutionaries compared themselves to ancient Romans and celebrated what they called republican virtue. But by this time, the lid on Pandora's box had already been opened, and destructive energies were released that co-opted the virtues and turned them into passions. I think the case can be made that pessimists like Mably, with their presumption of futility, made it more difficult for intelligent and energetic men like Jacques Necker and Turgot to be successful. Norman Hampson wrote of Mably, quote, "In a dialogue on the grain trade, a character called Mably dismissed free trade as something that would profit only merchants, encourage avarice, and lead to eventual monopoly. He was as dismissive of Necker as of Turgot, believing him to be motivated primarily by the pursuit of personal power. Even if he had higher motives, the corruption of French society would defeat all attempts at reform." Unquote. Mably assumes that Necker and Turgot were only interested in personal aggrandizement. And we shouldn't be surprised that people who take on difficult and perhaps even thankless tasks want some kind of reward for the work they do. Everyone in the real world has mixed motives, but the problem is that it's reductive to assume that only the worst motives prevail, and to interpret every action on the part of others in the light of the worst possible motives. Norman Hampson also noted that, quote, "Mably's utopian vision of the characteristics of a regenerated French society was accompanied by a growing pessimism about the possibility of their realization." Unquote. J. Wright, in his paper, Conversations with Phocion, The Political Thought of Mably, gives a more sophisticated interpretation of Mably's historical pessimism. Quote, "The repeated failure of enlightened reform from above, both in France and elsewhere, combined to make the prospects for the recovery of French liberty increasingly remote to Mably. He ended his intellectual career in a somber mood. The common theme of his last writings, a series of dialogues left unpublished at his death, might be termed the failure of agency, the tragic inability of mankind, individually and collectively, to master its fate by escaping from the constraints of custom and circumstance. But this final pessimism reflected more than mere political disappointment. It was, in a sense, the inevitable expression of a classical Republican outlook, a Machiavellian moment, as it were, prolonged into the disconcerting context of the twilight of the French Ancien Régime." Unquote. Certainly what Wright calls the failure of agency that is, the tragic inability of mankind individually and collectively to master its fate by escaping from the constraints of custom and circumstance, is a thought that all of us have entertained, and which might be called fate or determinism or even despair if one has invested one's hopes in Enlightenment conceptions of progress, or you might say in Enlightenment conceptions of utopia. We could compare Mably's pessimistic interpretation of human nature to Bishop Butler's moral theory, which saw human beings as primarily motivated to seek the good. Bishop Butler was, like Mably, a churchman and a man of the Enlightenment, but he represents the opposite end of the spectrum in the interpretation of human nature. The Enlightenment thinkers have always had a problem with human nature, and we've seen that the founding fathers, also men of the Enlightenment, weren't looking at men through the rose-colored spectacles that we find so often on other Enlightenment thinkers. Arguably, a system of government constructed on the assumption that human beings can and often do go wrong is going to be more realistic, more workable than a system of government constructed on wishful thinking. The government that the French got after the Revolution was by turns angry, petty, resentful, vicious, and murderous because it was constructed on illusions and wishful thinking. As Voltaire famously said, we commit atrocities because we believe absurdities. And believing in utopia is an absurdity. Mably didn't live to see the revolution. He died 4 years before it, but the successors he influenced did see it all unfold. Mably was sufficiently influential that at least 2 historians explicitly reacted against him: Jacques Nicolas Augustin Thierry and August Ludwig von Schlotzer. Thierry's reaction took him deeper into the past, to the early Middle Ages, while Schlotzer's reaction took the form of a reappraisal of modern history. Thierry himself acknowledged that he was reacting against the work of historians of the previous century, specifically mentioning the work of Mably and Thierry, whom he said described the events of the Middle Ages in a wholly false light. This is how Thierry described how he rejected the conventional history that he had once learned. Quote, "By imperceptible degrees, I abandoned modern books for ancient ones, histories for chronicles, and then I thought I could catch a glimpse of the truth which our writers had stifled under the conventional formulas and pompous style. I endeavored to erase from my mind everything they had taught me. I rebelled, as it were, against my masters." Unquote. Mably, like Gibbon, was an historian of the Enlightenment and a man of his time, and Enlightenment historiography was notorious for its failure to enter into the spirit of past events, which is probably connected to the inability of most Enlightenment figures to reckon honestly with human nature. Because to give an account of events, you need to have some, not just understanding, but you need to have some sympathy for how human nature expressed itself in a given period of the past. And you could say that that would be one formulation of historicism. The Enlightenment tradition in historiography was what Thierry was reacting against. But despite redistancing himself from Mably, Thierry eventually came to share Mably's pessimism. Lionel Gossman wrote of this, quote, "For Thierry himself, in the end, history is the domain of evil. The good and the true are synonymous with reason, and history stands for the accidental, the discontinuous, the irrational, and inessential," unquote. Schlotzer, a younger contemporary of Mably, did not share the pessimism of Mably and Thierry. He directly responded to Mably's historical pessimism, but through the indirect means of an open letter, which has since come to be called On Historiography. Schlotzer began his open letter with this observation, quote, "Is Mably not unfair to our modern times, unfair even to himself? Did the people presented in ancient history really possess a greatness and nobility which cannot be found in the new? And does modern history present only persons who are inferior by far to those of ancient Greece and Rome? Unquote. In the Battle of the Books, Schloetzer would have been a defender of the moderns, as he went on to say later in the same letter, quote, altogether, I should regard it as an inexplicable miracle if, as all sciences have progressed, the historiographer of our 18th century should not have surpassed, let alone equaled, the ancient Greeks and Romans, or even Buchanan and Grotius, unquote. But Schloetzer, while expressing his esteem for Mably, goes on to criticize Mably's merely belletristic history, implying that Schloetzer himself had at least glimpsed a more scientific history. Mably, the disappointed pessimist, had retreated from the world and praised the ancient virtue of ancient men now lost. And Nietzsche called this antiquarian history. With Rousseau, Mably belongs to the counter-Enlightenment, or what is sometimes called the autocritique of the Enlightenment, insofar as counter-Enlightenment figures like Mably and Rousseau were part of the Enlightenment, but nevertheless saw its failures, disappointments, and limitation. Schloetzer wasn't one to write paeans to progress. That would come with later Enlightenment writers like Condorcet. But he did have a vigorous faith in humanity and saw modern man as no less a man and no less capable of virtue than the legendary figures of classical antiquity. He intuited enough of Mably's disappointment with humanity's failure of agency that he looked beyond the American and French revolutions and sought alternative interpretations of the Enlightenment in Russia and the Balkans. In a fascinating paper, From Pennsylvania to Transylvania, August Ludwig Schloetzer and the Decentering of the Enlightenment, Modern Intellectual History, Benedict M. Varga gives the following account of Schloetzer's unusual interpretation of the Enlightenment. Quote, after the American War of Independence and the French Revolution, Schloetzer looked for evidence and proof that it was possible for the aims of the Enlightenment, which had failed in the colonies of the New World and on the streets of Paris, to be established in political communities and put into practice. If there was hope of finding true freedom in the revolutionary era, Schloetzer was searching for it at the eastern end of civilized Europe, not in the Atlantic world, unquote. I don't think this view would resonate widely with historians today, although we can say perhaps it should. We saw in the previous episode on Mircea Eliade that the history of the Balkans has lessons to teach us about the terror of history. Eliade could have schooled us on the failure of agency if he'd chosen to take up that theme, and we could interpret the terror of history as a recognition of the failure of human agency to shape history as we would like. The problem, of course, is inevitability. If we assume the inevitability of the failure of agency, we've already lost. Perhaps Schloetzer might have schooled Eliade in turn, since the modernity he defended, like Hans Blumenberg's defense of modernity, looks beyond the terror of history. For the modernist, the terror of history is a form of learned helplessness in which we must escape history through some coping mechanism, be it mythology or some other crutch, because we've given up on any attempts to assert ourselves in history. Eliade said that historical man is consciously and voluntarily historical. We can understand failure of agency as a failure to be consciously and voluntarily historical, and it's no wonder that a forfeiture of agency makes us vulnerable to the terror of history. The alternative is to take up the burden and to choose to be consciously and voluntarily historical. Terrors are never quite the same again after we've faced them down. Happy birthday, Gabriel Bonnot de Mably, and thanks for listening.